Just pull my shirt. Thanks. It's the end of the day. Thank you. Okay, so I'll be talking about developing a blue carbon database for the Pacific Northwest region. And this was our sort of third major objective of this stocks project that's been touched on already. So we wanted to assemble a blue carbon database for Oregon, Washington, and surrounding regions. We wanted to include data that were known on stocks, sequestration rates, and some basic environmental drivers. And we wanted to create a database that would potentially be expandable to other types of blue carbon data, so greenhouse gas emissions like methane fluxes, above and below ground biomass data, for instance. And we wanted to develop a database that would also meet the needs of a range of end users, so anywhere from researchers who want very detailed data for analyses to policymakers and managers who would use the data for restoration, management, and maybe even development of policies pertinent to the coastal zone. So these are some examples of the potential outcomes of developing a blue carbon database. So the database could provide us information on blue carbon stocks by habitat type, as we've already seen in Boone's presentation, or by geographic subregion. And those data might be of interest to managers, restoration planners, and so forth. A blue carbon database could also give us sequestration rates by wetland type. So this is something we haven't yet talked about a lot in this workshop, but I'll show a little bit of data on sequestration rates from the Pacific Northwest. And then researchers could use the database for uncertainty analyses over space, for instance. And then the database would also be very valuable for helping our project team as well as the broader community identify data gaps in the region. What additional kinds of blue carbon data do we need to really inform management and policy? So the geographic focus initially for the database was to be from Cape Mendocino, California, up to northern Washington. This is sort of the focal area of the Pacific Northwest Blue Carbon Working Group. And within that area, we have sort of three subregions. We have the outer coast of Washington and Oregon into northern California. We have the Salish Sea, and we have the Columbia River Estuary, which is sort of a huge system, sort of its own beast. As the database developed, my interest spanned a little bit larger geographic area. I wanted to include data from California, further down into San Francisco Bay and even farther south, and also any data from British Columbia or Alaska. So the database has expanded a little bit from the original focus. So we have all 5 of the wetland types that Boone talked about in our database: seagrass, low marsh, high marsh, forested tidal swamps, and pasture. We also are including other tidal wetland types. So shrub wetlands, there's a little bit of data from these ecosystems. Restored wetlands, we had to cut that out from the original stock sampling. That program was already ambitious enough, so we did not sample any restored sites. We've included some disturbed tidal wetlands, so these could be semi-tidal areas, for instance. They might have a little bit of tidal influence, and then tide flats, so sort of non-vegetated areas, typically adjacent to seagrass meadows. These are the variety of data types that we could include in our database. So sediment carbon stocks, as we talked about, above ground plant biomass, sediment accretion rates, so mineral plus organic, carbon sequestration rates, greenhouse gas flux rates, and then any data on allochthonous inputs and exports. Now, the availability of these data in the literature vary quite a bit. So we really focused on, at this point in the database, just 2 data types. So sediment carbon stocks, and then accretion rates, and from that you can calculate carbon sequestration rates if you have sort of a typical carbon density. So these data are core level data. The sediment carbon stocks, as you'll see, is the most common type of data that we've been able to locate. but we also have dated cores, either with cesium-137, lead-210, sometimes carbon-14, and then a little bit of set data as well. So the database in the future can be expandable to include these other types of blue carbon information, but this is our focus for this project. So the sources of the data. So most of the data has actually come from within the working group itself, and the working group is pretty broad. We have people working all over the region, working on many aspects of blue carbon. So just amongst our collaborations, we've been able to locate the majority of these data sets. We've also done a few Web of Science searches to look for places like Alaska where we really don't have any data so far. And the Smithsonian CCRCN database has been a source of a couple data sets because they've already done the work compiling these, and we're working with the CCRCN. So we've imported a couple of their data sets, particularly from California. And then social media, interestingly enough, Craig mentioned that I set up a Twitter account for our working group. Not on there very often, but occasionally we'll tweet and ask, does anyone have blue carbon data for the Northwest? And we've been able to learn of a couple of data sets through social media as well. Okay, so these are the data sets that are currently in today's iteration of the database, about 18 studies. The top one is the data that Boone presented, so covers Northern California, Oregon, and Washington, 4 habitat types, and we have 204 stocks cores. So that by far is the largest part of the database. It's about 35% of the stocks data that we've been able to accumulate. We also will have a few sequestration cores that have been collected, and there we have some additional funds to analyze those and get a few sequestration rates, particularly for tidal swamps, which, as you'll see, are kind of underrepresented in the database. The next largest data set is from Oregon. It's a paper in review. Erin Peck is a graduate student at OSU. She has a lot of marsh, in particular, data from Oregon. And then you guys can read all of this. But we have a variety of data sets covering all the way from British Columbia to the San Francisco Bay Area, and including a variety of habitats. There are additional data sets that we are aware of. Some of these people have communicated with us that they're willing to share data. We don't have the data yet. A few of these are just data sets that I know about, that somebody's working in a particular region on a particular question, and we're hoping that everyone will share data with us. And I'll just say at this point that it's been great. A very high percentage of our data are still unpublished. It might be 70, 80%. And people willing to share unpublished data is a wonderful thing in science because it doesn't happen all that much. So it's been wonderful that so many people have shared their unpublished data with us. We've sort of mentioned that we'll probably do a synthesis on this and that they're welcome to be co-authors, which I think always is a motivation for sharing data, but it's been great. So these are some additional data sets. If we were to obtain all of these, I think we would have maybe another 250 or 300 cores that we could add. So it's been a surprise just how much data are out there. A lot of it unpublished, though. So there are currently 568 cores in the database. We span northern British Columbia to the San Francisco Bay Area. Relatively even distribution in California, Oregon, and Washington, less so in BC, and then we currently have nothing from Alaska, but I think I'm aware of 2 potential Alaska data sets that would be great to incorporate if the authors are willing to share with us. This is a map of the distribution of the cores in British Columbia and Washington. So the Skeena Estuary in BC is our northernmost site. Most of the BC coastline are data gaps, but we do have a couple of cores from Vancouver Island as well. This is Washington. We have cores from the eastern Salish Sea or central Salish Sea. Here we have Skokomish, Nisqually, Grace Harbor, and Willapa Bay. And these are the cores from Oregon and Washington. So we have the Columbia River estuary. We have a lot of the medium to smaller estuaries on the Oregon coast. We have Humboldt Bay, and then we have quite a bit from the San Francisco Bay Area into the fresher part of the Delta. I'm aware of some additional data sets in Tamales Bay, and Bodega Bay. So we'll hopefully have a little bit more that covers the Northern California region. Okay, so this is a summary of the cores. This is all the cores, so stocks or sequestration or both, according to wetland type. So TF, these are tidal flats, seagrass, tidal marsh, scrub shrub, tidal swamp, and pasture. So the vast majority of our cores are from tidal marsh. We have a moderate number of cores from seagrass meadows, but our woody wetlands, so our Sitka spruce swamp and our scrub shrub wetlands are we have much smaller sample sizes for these and only a few cores from tidal flats. We've talked a little bit about woody wetlands, and they really present sort of an interesting story here. We think of the emergent marshes as sort of being our dominant wetland type that we have in the Pacific Northwest, but there's indications, particularly historical work that's been done by a number of people. This is some recent work by Laura Brophy that suggests that actually it's probably our woody wetlands occupied a really high fraction of the area within our estuaries. So if you compare that to our actual data set, you see that we really are skewed in sort of our picture of blue carbon stocks and sequestration and their potential in the Pacific Northwest. So this map here is from the Siuslaw estuary. I think it's the little red specks, if you can see them, are the existing tidal swamps in this estuary in Central Oregon, but most of the areas that were probably formerly tidal wetlands have been lost, up to 96% in this particular estuary. Okay, this is a summary of the cores in the database by disturbance level. So NAT, that's just natural or sort of a least disturbed system. We have a couple of disturbed wetlands. We have some impounded. So these would be the pastures that Boone's team sampled, and then other sort of potentially formerly tidal but currently non-tidal areas. We have a few restored cores, and then a couple that we just haven't been able to classify yet, but hopefully we can classify them in one of these 4 categories. This is what the distribution of the cores looks like by their length. So some of the cores are quite long. They go to 2 or 3 meters in length, and with that, one is able to sort of get the full or almost the full carbon stocks for a particular ecosystem. A lot of the cores are quite a bit shallower, though. So the median core length is only 76 centimeters. It's less than a meter in length. And there are a lot of cores that are much shallower. So we tried to limit, I think 18 or 20 centimeters was sort of the minimum that we would take there. The data would grow a little bit if you include really, really shallow cores, but I'm not sure that's prudent for a number of reasons. So we kind of stopped at about a minimum of 18 or 20 centimeters. Okay, so the database structure, and try not to bore you too much with how it looks, but we have, at this point, the database is really a series of flat files, and they're linked by a core ID. So we give every core a unique identifier, whether it contains stocks data, sequestration, or both. And then we have a series of flat files. We have one that summarizes the core location and environmental data, such as vegetation, elevation, if known, core depth, etc. Then we have the largest part of the database is a flat file that includes the data on bulk density, carbon content, accretion rate, and carbon accumulation rate. So this is a sort of a down core value. So every stratum that is sampled in the core gets its own line in the database. And then if the database is expanded in the future, we'll have flat files for above ground and below ground biomass, and then potentially greenhouse gas emissions data. Okay, so Boone uses a very standardized sampling method. It's great for comparison within the data set as well as the other areas of the world that he's sampled. But these cores come from very heterogeneous data sets. We need to think about ways to standardize them and make the data comparable so that we can do broader analyses. So our minimum amount of data that we try to collect for a core and for computing carbon stocks is a bulk density and a % carbon. Now, not all of the cores have % carbon, which is usually estimated with a CHN analyzer. A number of them just have percent organic matter, which is usually estimated by loss on ignition. So to convert, we need to convert everything into percent carbon. So we take the percent organic matter and convert that into a percent carbon based on one of several empirical relationships that have been developed. Now, the database is flexible, that we can plug in a different conversion equation. You can sort of choose your own. For this analysis, I've used 3. So for Oregon and British Columbia marshes and tidal swamps, I've used data for the OSU graduate student, Aaron Peck. And for Oregon to British Columbia seagrasses, I've used a recent paper, Postlewaite et al. And then for San Francisco Bay Area marshes, because it's sort of a different climate regime and much more mineral sediment dominated, I used the Callaway et al. 2012 data. So this is a relationship. They often look like this. Some are slightly curvilinear and so forth, and they relate organic matter to carbon content. Now, once you have both bulk density and percent carbon, you can convert into a carbon density. So we do that for each stratum of the core. And then the way to compute carbon stocks is to simply add up the carbon values for all the strata. Now, the size of the length of each sampling stratum, L here, varies a lot. So in the case of our projects team, we sampled 0 to 15, 15 to 30, and so forth. A lot of the cores actually do a much finer stratum. They measure carbon and bulk density every centimeter or every 2 centimeters, particularly if they're doing radiocarbon dating. They'll use that approach. So we incorporate all of this, and then we're able to kind of have a standardized way to look at down-core carbon stocks. This is just an example core. This one happens to be from South San Francisco Bay. This is a core that went very deep. I think it went probably to 2 or 3 meters. The approach was C14, so they were using microfossils inside the sediment to date the core. Sort of a different time scale than we might think about, much more on the millennium time scale. But this is an example of their data. To sort of standardize the data sets, at least at this iteration, I've computed stocks to 2 different depths, so ½ meter and then 1 meter. So we sum all of the carbon densities in those strata. And then this will come up a little bit later, but I also compute a mean carbon density that's below the rhizosphere. And the thinking behind this is if we want to estimate carbon sequestration rates, we probably just want to look at the carbon that's going to be stored long-term in the sediments. So carbon near the surface may include a lot of labile carbon that could be decomposed. It may include a lot of fine root material, for instance, that won't necessarily stick around. So as sort of a very first crude pass, I've computed carbon density at about 20 to 30 centimeters in the core that might kind of represent the amount of carbon that would stick around for the long term. I'm happy to talk about that more later because it seems like a very complicated question, but this is our first approach. Okay, so this is a summary from the database of the carbon stocks by wetland type, and this will somewhat mirror the results that Boone has showed, in part because 35% of the data are that data set, but the patterns that Boone has shown really hold for the broader data set. So on the left, we have the carbon stocks to ½ meter, and then the right panel is to the top meter of sediment. And some striking differences, tidal flats and seagrass have low carbon stocks. Not surprising based on what Boone presented, but a little bit surprising that tidal flats may actually have slightly higher carbon stocks than seagrass meadows. Sample sizes are low there, so it'd be interesting to see if that really holds up. Tidal marshes, scrub shrub wetlands, and tidal swamps all have pretty high carbon stocks. And surprisingly to me, the pastures seem to have relatively high carbon stocks as well. So this is just a different way to divide the data. These are carbon stocks by geographic region divided up. These are the 2 largest sample sizes are for seagrass meadows and emergent marshes. So meadows on the left, some indication that maybe Washington seagrass meadows, sorry Jude, are a little bit lower in carbon content than some of the other geographic regions, although not a lot of data from California or BC yet, but probably more data for those two states on its way. And then emergent marshes, on the other hand, tend to have sort of similar stocks regardless of the geographic region. A lot of variability and a lot of spread in the data, indicating that there's a lot of site-to-site differences, but overall means are somewhat similar across these areas, and the sample sizes are pretty good for the emergent marsh. So to zero in a little bit more on the carbon stocks in tidal marshes, so that green box there, that's our sort of most well-represented wetland type in the data set. And I just pulled there's a lot more literature values, I'm sure, but I just pulled values from a couple of other areas for comparison. So in the Northeast Pacific, we have a mean of 260 megagrams per hectare in our tidal marshes in the top meter. And some comparable data from Australia and China show somewhat lower carbon stocks, and then somewhat higher value for tropical Mexico, although it's a really small sample size. So one cool thing is already the Australia paper, I think it came out a couple years ago, but you know, that was a continent-wide analysis, so it's really cool that we have at least as many data points for the Pacific Northwest as other parts of the world. So it'd be really cool to eventually summarize all this information. So moving on from stocks, so almost everything we've talked about today are stocks, how much carbon is there, but for restoration purposes, for management, for financing and so forth, we also want to know accretion rates and how much carbon may be sequestered by these ecosystems. So we've compiled accretion rate data for these habitat types. In total, there are probably about 120 to 150 cores in the database that have accretion rates from which we can calculate carbon accumulation rate. So it's only about a fifth of the size of the stocks data, but we do expect to receive some more data soon. So these are sediment accretion rates in millimeters per year for our different habitat types. And I've just put on two representative sea level rise rates from NOAA tide gauges, so Seattle and then Charleston, Oregon. So you can see that for the most part, our wetlands are accreting at rates that meet or exceed local rates of sea level rise. So this is great for the near term. Global projections of sea level rise are that it will accelerate. Some indications from satellite data that it's already starting to accelerate. So whether our marshes and other wetlands will be keeping pace with sea level rise in 30 or 50 years is a different question, but currently sort of keeping pace. From the combination of the accretion rate data and then that average carbon density sort of below the root zone, we can calculate some rough carbon accumulation rates by wetland type. So these data are here. Again, the sample sizes are really small except for marshes where we have about 100 cores. And these are only the lead 210 data. So we have some cores that were dated with cesium and then a few with C14. But for methodological reasons and for timescale reasons, we probably need to do more work to see if those are actually comparable. So I've just isolated the lead 210 data here. So sequestration rates, sort of a median sequestration rate for a tidal marsh is about 70 grams per meter squared per year. Lower for tide flats and seagrass, and potentially higher for scrub shrub and tidal swamp, although super small sample sizes. So this is cool because it reinforces some of the other points made today that the tidal swamps are holding a lot of carbon and that they're a very important ecosystem type. And if these numbers hold up, they're also sequestering a lot of carbon on an annual basis. Okay, so again, just looking at the marsh data set because the other samples are pretty small. These are the carbon sequestration rates by geographic region, and similar to the stocks data, they don't seem to vary a whole lot by area. But there's a lot of variability within a region. So again, that small scale site to site or estuary to estuary variability could be important in planning projects and trying to get estimates of sequestration rate for a particular study system. Again, I tried to pull a couple of numbers from the literature. Hard to know from their studies exactly how many samples they included, but again, the Australia data set had a lower mean carbon accumulation rate, whereas in China they found a much higher mean carbon accumulation rate. But our range from 13 to 334 is a really large range for the region. Okay, so from the database, we anticipate a couple of products emerging. So one are these detailed flat files that I kind of outlined. And our goal for these is ultimately probably to include them in the Smithsonian's global database that they're developing. They put a lot of work into the structure and as well as a web interface. There's not a lot of reason for us to duplicate that. So we're going to, with the original author's permission, we're going to share the data with the CCRCN so that the detailed information will be available for researchers and anyone else who wants to download it. We've also been thinking about providing an end user summary that is not, you know, an 11,000 line spreadsheet like it is right now, which gives me headaches. So we thought about providing a sort of a summary that would give you average and range of stocks and sequestration rates by region or wetland habitat type. So this is an area where we'd love feedback in terms of what would meet your needs and what would be helpful. So we could provide this on a web platform or some other means. And then the final thing that I don't think was really a goal when we wrote the proposal for the project, but I think would be a great idea is to actually do a data synthesis of all of this information, because we really have a large data set, and we can look at a number of questions. So for instance, we can look at variability in stocks by habitat type, similar to what Boone's doing. We could potentially take a second look at climate driver relationships with stocks and sequestration rates on a broader geographic scale. We can identify data gaps. Clearly, woody wetlands are a major data gap. And if anybody is interested in contributing data or contributing time to helping with an analysis or writing, please let me know. If we're able to complete the data synthesis, we'll probably have a 30 or 40 author papers, since so many people have contributed their hard work. So the first database product I want to outline a little bit more. The CCRCN has been mentioned. You can go to this top website here and read all about their methodology and their units. You can, they have a very rigorous data quality control and standardization and so forth. We've been working with them to provide these data sets, in large part because a lot of the Pacific Northwest has not been published so far. The CCRCN also has an atlas, so you can go, you can try to do it on your phone. I've tried to do it on my phone. It's not great, but just get on a desktop. You can zoom in into an area. You can see exactly what data sets are available for your area. You can click on those, and then I think a little window pops up and you can get the core level information. So they only have a few Pacific Northwest data sets available right now, but hopefully in a couple months as we work more with them, there'll be a lot more available for the region. And they're also hosting several blue carbon working groups. So I'm involved with one of those working groups. They'll have another one that's forming relatively soon that deals with methane. So methane's come up a lot, and they're really trying to get a better handle on methane fluxes throughout the country. Okay, so this is just an example of our potential second product, if this is of use and valuable to end users and stakeholders. This would be an example of a very web-friendly database. Here it's an app called Airtable, and you can sort of upload very simple spreadsheets with summary data for cores. You can also upload photographs of the site, and so it's kind of a nice, user-friendly, but a little bit more elegant than a basic spreadsheet. So this is one potential way that we could share some of the summary data with end users. And then the last product, just a little bit more detail on the synthesis. So some of the goals of a synthesis, I think, should be summarizing stocks and sequestration rates by wetland types for the region. There are a few areas where we actually have a lot of data. So Rush Ranch in the San Francisco Bay Area, for instance, Nisqually Estuary. There's a handful of areas where we have a sufficient density of cores that we could probably look at patterns of spatial variability as well. So we could ask whether stocks are variable regionally, within an estuary, within a site, and take a little bit closer look at that. So again, if anyone's interested in working on this synthesis paper, please let me know. So some of the, pulling together a heterogeneous data set has a lot of challenges. Just summarized a few of them here. One is that we have two types of carbon data. Both CHN analysis and LOI, and so we have to make those talk in a coherent way. LOI methodology itself can be variable, and this paper by Hyre et al. Shows that even simple things like the length of time you put your sample in the oven and the temperature and even the placement of the sample inside the oven chamber itself can affect your organic matter estimate, which it's frustrating to learn all of that, but good to know that that all can add variability to your data set. We have considerable variation in the core depth. We have about an 18 centimeter minimum here. But if the core is not very deep, if it's only 25 centimeters, then to estimate stocks to a meter, we have to extrapolate, and there's always some error associated with that. For accretion rates, we have variable methodologies, and they do tend to give sort of different answers. So accretion rates with cesium-137 tend to be larger than they are with lead-210. And the other problem is that cesium is increasingly not a great tracer to use. So its half-life means that it won't be relevant for much longer. So lead-210 is apparently the way to go in the future for dating cores. We have almost the vast majority of our data are unpublished, so we have to respect authors' wishes in terms of sharing the data more broadly, so that's a challenge. And we have varying levels of replication where we have an older data set that has one core from Padilla Bay, and then we have a data set from Rush Ranch that has 20 cores, so we have a lot of variation in replication. And then in some cores, we have gaps in down core profiles, so samples get lost. Researchers decide they sample every 2 centimeters, and they don't want to analyze every 2 centimeters, so we have to do some interpolation to get final values. Okay, so just a few comments on data gaps. So the database is very heavily skewed towards emergent marsh. We need a lot more data from woody wetlands. So that would include Sitka spruce, Picea sitchensis swamps. They occur from British Columbia to about southern Oregon. But there are other swamps like Salix and Cornu swamps, some in the Pacific Northwest, some in the California Delta. Very sparse data on those ecosystems, but there was discussion about how they may be an important transition between a marsh and a forested wetland. We have a lot more stocks data than sequestration rate data, so the latter would be great if anybody knows of additional data sources. And we need more on restored wetlands, particularly accretion rates and carbon accumulation rates. There are some geographic gaps as well. So this is a map from a recent publication, but it just shows all of the estuaries in the Pacific Northwest. And there are a ton of tiny estuaries that are almost never sampled. So the smaller estuaries, often we don't have any carbon data for those. This is one of my favorite tiny estuaries in Mendocino County. This is a gorgeous estuary. It's within a state park. It's probably preserved in perpetuity. There are some small marshes. There are some gorgeous eelgrass beds if you kayak farther up the estuary. It's very small and probably doesn't contribute a lot in terms of a regional carbon pool, but it probably will be preserved forever. And there are issues of sea level rise and whether the carbon is going to be stable in those ecosystems. British Columbia is relatively undersampled. We just have 3 data sets right now from BC, 3 or 4. And we're missing Alaska, but hopefully we'll have some Alaska data. And there are a couple of our larger estuaries in the Northwest where we don't have much data at all. So Willapa Bay is one really big estuary, southern Washington, and then the Fraser River in southern BC. I don't think we have any data from the Fraser. So in terms of long-term data storage, we will be working with the CERC, with the CCRCN, to make sure that these data have a life beyond the length of this particular project. And then the NERS CDMO may also be, they may be able to host a copy of our data set as well. So beyond the lifetime of these grants, which end in a couple of months, it would be great if we, as a working group, can procure additional funding to keep the database going, and potentially to expand the database. So, yeah, thanks. The CDMO is it's kind of an online interface. You know more about it than I do, but it's the NERS online interface for downloading mainly hydrologic data, right? Tides and nutrients and, or Jude, you know.
Sure. No, I think this is, yeah, the NERS CDMO, the National Estuarine Research Reserve Central Data Management Office. Each Estuarine Research Reserve, there are 29 throughout the country, has at least 4 long-term monitoring sites measuring all these water quality parameters every 15 minutes since 1995. So all of those data are housed on the CDMO and can be visualized and pulled down real time. We also store a tremendous amount of data from Science Collaborative and other projects. And so we just had a meeting last week in Charleston talking about this exact thing. So the plan is for the CDMO to ramp up to be able to host and make available a series of flat files that could be associated with this project. Cool. So we get a lot of traffic to there. It'll be a great place for these data.
Yeah, that'll be great. So if they have interest in, we can have a copy of the data there as well. And then with additional funding, we have the potential to expand the database as well. Sort of just the amount of data we acquired and the heterogeneity of it sort of limited us to looking at just stocks and sequestration. But a variety of plant biomass data, set data, and greenhouse gas emissions data could be accumulated as well. So just, I think this is my last slide, some take-home messages. Heard this all day, that Northwest has very high carbon stocks, particularly in marshes and swamps. We have a lot of variability within a habitat type, potentially some differences by geographic region. So for seagrass, for instance, we could have lower carbon stocks in Washington than some of our other areas in the Northwest. And then the data gaps that remain for our region include particularly sequestration rate data, woody wetlands in particular. We need additional data from restored and disturbed systems, and then there are some geographic data gaps that we could aim to fill with subsequent research. All right, well, thank you. Any questions? Yes. Where'd it go? Mm-hmm. I think I've seen that one before, yeah.
It's a global database managed by folks out of NCEAS, and there might be data sets in there that might be useful to you if you haven't found your way there yet, but it'd also be a good place if you want these data to be seen by researchers from and government representatives from around the world.
Okay,
yeah. Some visibility.
Yeah, thanks for the suggestion. I'm always surprised at data that just pop up. I'm reading a study cited by a study, and I'm like, oh, wow, they have core data, and I never found it on Web of Science or whatever. So, yeah, thanks for the suggestion. Any other questions? Or, all right. Oh.
This is more of a comment than a question, but to see all of this come together, Chris, and the work that has gone behind it, like, I'll put out another round of applause. Like, pulling all this together and doing the analyses and seeing, like, this finally come to fruition is really cool. So thank you for all the work that you put
Thanks.
into it. That's really
I was definitely intimidated in the beginning because I thought I was going to have to build like an app or something. So we've kept it pretty simple, but it's been cool to just find so many data sets. And then if we get this additional dozen too, that'll be really cool.
Okay. What is this? Okay, last but not least, this is the next step session where we talk about where we're going with all this. So we've been talking all day about what's been accomplished, but there's been quite a bit of information presented that indicates that there are a bunch of data gaps. And because I did this before this meeting, I had a pretty good idea of what the data gaps were, but there are some things that are going to be missing here. But so just in general, I just want to go through some of the data gaps that are most obvious, and you guys let me know what needs to be added. And then I have sort of a straw proposal to offer, and then we can, so the idea is to talk about what's in that proposal for a next step, or proposals, and we'll shape that straw proposal. Okay, so two of the biggest data gaps that we've been hearing about all day include greenhouse gas emissions and carbon sequestration rates in the suite of habitats that we've been talking about. In particular, the restored tidal wetlands, which we weren't able to include in the carbon stocks project. This is not a surprise because, as I mentioned at the beginning today, that the stocks piece was the first thing that the Blue Carbon Working Group was going to focus in on for the big first comprehensive blue carbon project for our region, understanding that we need to get to the emissions and the carbon sequestration rates. By the way, I'm not sure if I recall anyone mentioning this, but in the carbon stocks project, at the suggestion of end users, we did collect 23 carbon sequestration rate cores that we didn't have money to analyze, but the idea was if we have Boone and Amy's crew out there, might as well collect them and freeze them, and then we'll figure out where to get the money after that. As it turns out, we did have some money, so we've been able to get a handful of those done. So we're sort of on the road to getting those done. Okay, so that's that. And what we're also hearing was that we wanted to focus in particular on methane variability driven by temperature, salinity, land use, site conditions, and site history. So within that greenhouse gas emissions piece at the top, it might make sense, or I'm hearing that we're going to want to focus, we're going to want to drill in on the methane piece there. And again, drilling in on another part of the first overall data gap is the carbon sequestration rates and greenhouse gas emissions in reed canary grass wetlands and wet pastures. So these are pieces that came out of the feasibility assessment. Filling in some of these gaps is going to add some confidence in the next iteration of that kind of assessment. And then we heard about the allochthonous carbon dynamics, the need to really to nail down what those dynamics are in those same suite of habitat types and disturbed and restored in those range of conditions. And then as an overall, we need to know what the effects of sea level rise are going to be on all of that. So there's that. So what's missing there? Microphone? Or I can repeat. Oops.
I guess I'll say again with the reed canary grass, because we don't want to achieve one goal at the expense of another goal, and you know, the invasives may be eliminating salmon habitat, that perhaps also evaluating possible native species that may have serve a different ecological function and actually serve a habitat function. I talked to our tribal wetland ecologist about what species would probably be there if the reed canary grass wasn't there, and he said there was a sedge. I forgot the species, but because I don't know it. But that might be worth looking at, you know, just so that you're not just strictly focusing on carbon, but sequestering carbon and
Yes.
restoring habitat.
And I would say that the interest in the reed canary grass piece is less about sending a message to people that we need more reed canary grass and more about helping evaluate change in the feasibility assessment mode, where you've got reed canary grass and you're going to convert it, and it's looking like there's this invasive plant that is establishing quite a bit of or sequestering carbon, but we don't know what the methane piece is there. So please don't get the idea that there's going to be a message out there to people that they need to conserve reed canary grass. And actually, you guys correct me, but there's a do no harm clause in the methodology that says you can't do that, or it's not going to work if you have people just wanting to, you know, do what you're kind of talking about.
Sometimes, depending on people's interests, they selectively use the data and push a particular part of the data, such as, you know, maybe
Right.
this invasive is great because it's sequestering all this carbon.
Yeah, we were talking about this last night, and you're echoing a major concern that I have about that. But there are those caveats. So, microphone here. Go ahead.
I also wrote down from today's presentation, Lisa, that, oh, it's not on, I'm sorry. Is that better? No, is that better?
There you go.
Okay. I also wrote down from today's presentation by Lisa, in addition to a focus on methane, a focus on nitrous oxide, which, because it has sort of 100 times the factor, I think is really important as well.
Okay. Scott, did you have something to add to the?
Yeah, I just was going to underline what you said, that, I mean, when we're doing carbon projects, we have to understand what's going on in the baseline. So if reed canary grass is out there today, and there's a greenhouse gas flux, we need to understand that to be able to do a carbon project. So I know there's sort of risk in how people interpret it, but we need the data to be able to understand what's the greenhouse gas flux with the reed canary grass versus the native grass. And hopefully we find, there's better arguments on a greenhouse gas basis that we can make to support more native shrubs, but we don't have a lot of the data on that. We have some estimates on soil carbon, but we don't know the methane. And I know in other settings, like on the East Coast, you have like Phragmites, which is very invasive. It's a big soil builder, but it's also a big source of methane. So with more data, we're able to show that it's actually not positive on the greenhouse gas balance.
Boone. I'm going to go with Amy real quick here.
I was just going to add, in addition to the scenario you just went through of reed canary grass with restoration kind of replacing reed canary grass, there's also the scenario where you have wet pasture that's restored and it becomes reed canary grass. So that's kind of the downside of what you're alluding to potentially.
Okay, Boone.
Yeah, I was just going to say, instead of focusing on particular on CH4, we ought to be focusing on net ecosystem carbon balance of these different sites, because we need to know rates of sequestration, total inputs, as well as emissions. And focusing just on CH4, you're really going to miss the boat. The vast majority of the greenhouse gases is still CO2. If you don't measure CO2, you're never going to know what emissions rates are. So you need to, we ought to measure, and I'm sure Scott is, CO2 as well as methane as well as N2O to get that balance.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. That top one says greenhouse gas emissions, so that includes the full suite. So don't get me wrong. I was just hearing some particular interest in an emphasis on the methane piece that had to do with the feasibility assessment work.
Well, once again, methane's interesting scientifically, but I think that if you focus too much on it operationally or functionally, it may not,
Right.
may not be as relevant.
Other additions? Ron?
Okay, yeah. I guess I have some questions about things that might contribute to the spatial variation in the data. And one of them is the effect of vertical land movement. You know, these subsidence earthquakes, and so a lot of these coastal marshes are new, relatively new. And will their amount of carbon that they store eventually increase or decrease, or what, through time? That's just one question I had about that. And it seems like the effect of temperature, because of its control on metabolism, and the fact that the temperature may get warmer, how that might affect carbon stocks. I'm also interested in progradation, marshes growing. So they're expanding one way, and they're accreting, and so their upper end is changing. So the whole, composition of the system is changing, and how that, if you're looking at a larger scale, how that's going to change that amount of carbon that can be sequestered. But that's kind of more of a modeling study. So, and the other thing is, relative sea level rise. We know that, like Cape Flattery's, the sea is falling. Seattle, the sea is rising. It's that whole thing is. So just being careful about comparing sea level rise rates that you get in the one that's specific to a site. So those are some things that are going through my head. I don't know if they're really. I think for me the Alachna's point is probably the most important right now.
Okay. Anything else? Other additions? Couple Padilla Bay people?
One thing I'd like to see is a little bit more, some data, any data on salt marshes specifically. We don't have a ton of them here in the Pacific Northwest, but everything we've seen up here has been everything but salt marshes. And at least, especially for Padilla Bay, I think the Skagit, for example, the maps show the Samish, Padilla, and Skagit Bay as the estuary, which it used to be historically, but now the Samish and the Padilla areas, we can do restoration there, and it's going to be salt marsh. It's not going to be what it used to be because the Skagit is no longer connected there. And then just looking around the Salish Sea, we have something on the in the Puget Sound portion, just the Puget Sound portion, I think it's something like 650 different small lagoonal, or what we kind of call pocket estuary type systems, which are quite small and have a lot of salt marsh in them. So it's not regionally a huge acreage of area, but it's something that I would like to see some data on.
And by salt marsh, are you talking about above 18 parts per thousand?
Yeah. So I'm talking about above mesohaline,
yeah.
higher salinity. Yeah.
So one thing I'd like us to think about after this is our messaging with this. So going into this project, and all of us who have been interested in blue carbon, it's like, well, forests are great, but emergent tidal marshes are even better at storing long-term carbon. And then when we look at our data, like, well, they're great if they have forests on them. And so, we're going to be working with the Skagit group tomorrow and sort of just thinking, okay, how do we make sure, because the message we have from some of our data is that, well, actually marshes, from the feasibility side, marshes might not be that valuable of a carbon sequestration system or habitat. Part of that may be because we have a gap in the higher salinity salt marshes in there, and the methane is offsetting that. But I think there's some mitigating that message, especially with the Skagit group, like, oh, we've spent a lot of time looking at this and none of these marshes have a carbon value. Well, we weren't interested in blue carbon 2 years ago and we're still not, so I'm just, there's a messaging issue that I think we should think through on this, that I'm trying to think through.
Okay.
Hey, devil's advocate there, I disagree completely in the fact that the marshes are great here. Are you kidding me? If we threw out the swamp data, the marsh results of the dramatic quantity of carbon that intact, undisturbed salt marshes or low marsh, high marsh, however you want to call it, they hold a lot of carbon here. So I think that's a very, very significant finding, and that, like I said, we don't even have to talk about salt marsh. I think that the value of these ecosystems are, as sinks of carbon, is very important. And that's one of the important results of our research today.
So
I was out in a 6-foot-plus high surface, like they store a tremendous amount of carbon, but if you think about that in the context of methane emissions and feasibility, there's two messages. So they store a lot of carbon, and we need to preserve them so that's not liberated, which is totally great. So the conservation message is there, but the restoration message may not be as strong. That's kind of where I am, but I'd love to be talked through that more.
Well, I think the context for this conversation here and most of today is, what's it going to take to use the current restoration methodology to help finance restoration here with carbon financing. And so what we heard this morning was, it's not playing out very well for below 18 parts per thousand marshes, which we have a lot of here, but it may play out nicely. Of course, more data needed to confirm that or deny that, but it does seem to be playing out okay. There's more possibilities for forested wetlands. But what you talked about, Boone, was what you just said, is in the Pacific Northwest, we have a lot here to conserve. So that brings us to the next methodology, which is the conservation piece, which there's value in conserving these things. And since I have no idea what that methodology entails, that might be the next horizon, is to talk about, you know, how these incredible blue carbon assets that we have here get conserved. So there's the restoration on one hand, which is complicated, and then the conservation on the other hand, which remains to be seen exactly how that works. Is that a fair way to describe that? Can we get him a microphone? Thanks, you guys, for being patient with these microphones.
I think the other thing we've been trying to emphasize today is the uncertainties and Lisa's uncertainty analysis, or is that what you call it, the uncertainty analysis, and how much that changed the outcome from a greenhouse gas perspective, both related to methane and related to the baseline carbon stocks and sequestration rates. Right, so that's another thing not to lose track of, Jude, I think. I mean, I agree, like, just the initial first pass, hey, it didn't look as promising as we hoped it would. You know, I don't think anyone can disagree with that. But I think there's still, and that's why, you know, I think this discussion is important about what science to prioritize as we go forward.
I'm really happy that you mentioned the sensitivity analysis that she did, because I was keying in on that as a guide for future research to try to dial in those two axes for each system.
Steve?
Also in terms of the messaging, you know, the conservation is very important. And you know, one thing to celebrate in a way is that in the last few decades there's been a lot of work on conservation, so we should keep that up. Another part of it is, you know, because of the methane, the carbon financing doesn't look like it pencils out too well until we get more information on some of the habitats. But what we haven't talked about, and one of the important messages that's not related to carbon financing, is that we only really recognize in terms of carbon stock change what goes in the soil, you know, biomass, soil, atmosphere, blah, blah, blah. But of that part of the, you know, the extraction of carbon from the atmosphere into the soil, there's a lot of lateral flux in various forms, dissolved organic carbon, particulate organic carbon, and that goes into the food chain, and that's what's supporting the fisheries as well. So outside of the climate change benefits, the sequestration of carbon that comes with increasing your wetland area has a big impact on the food chain. And so while there's not a greenhouse gas story there yet, there is an ecosystem story. We should emphasize that ecosystem story as well as part of this.
Just a quick comment that reminds me of, so in the 90s there was this really hot ecological debate as to whether more species meant more productivity, and so some of those experiments started with Dave Tillman on grasslands, and the literature sort of exploded on that. And what was found is that in a lot of systems, once you had 4 or 8 species in a grassland, you didn't really get a lot of enhanced productivity. So then the messaging became sort of multifunctionality, and we don't want diversity just because it promotes productivity, but we want diversity because it prevents invasion, because it creates habitat structure, because it supports a whole suite of functions. So I wonder if there's sort of an analogy, which I think you were kind of getting at. There's an analogy here that you know, estuaries are important for many, many reasons. Carbon is one, but not the sole. And maybe that really needs to be a key part of the messaging.
Jude, did you?
Yeah, I just felt compelled with Boone's, like, I want to play devil's advocate. Like, I'm on the same team here. what I'm doing is posing these questions because as I talk with managers or legislators or develop proposals, I need to make sure that I'm building a strong argument that's evidence-based. And sort of putting that out to this group who are also thinking about it helps us build, as a community, a strong evidence-based argument for moving forward and knowing where our gaps are and knowing how to describe the shortcomings and highlight the strengths. So anyway, I'm just, people who don't know me, you're not walking around like, Jude guy doesn't care about blue carbon. Just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, well, we have the difficult, it's easy to make all of this go like this, in this direction, where we want to do 3,000 things, because it's all, we need to know all of it. But from this slide forward, we have to start doing this and making some tough decisions about what are the priorities and how do those priorities get translated into the next funding proposal. So with that as a segue, unless you had, yep, Haida.
Just one more thing I wanted to add, because I think Steve's presentation touched on it this morning, and then Phil brought it up at a break, and we have a new project that kind of relates to it that Chris is leading on the ecological effects of sea level rise, is kind of the landscape mosaic. And I think that's, in terms of the messaging, Jude, like some of that, there's going to be trade-offs in order to have diversity at that larger landscape scale, not just within each ecosystem type. And so if we think about the marshes needing to be there, the low marshes need to be there, the high marshes need to be there, because that's a part of the process of the accretion, and then the shrub scrub needs to be there, and the swamp needs to be there. It all needs to be there because of that landscape thinking.
Yeah, and funny you should mention that project, because as we talk about what the next steps are and the data gaps, it just so happens that just this month, this project that Chris is leading is getting underway, and it's a project. Well, actually, Chris, do you want to just describe this project? And it does get at, it starts to get at filling a couple of these data gaps in a couple sites that we're already looking at. So.
Yeah. So NOAA's had this EESLR program for probably about a decade. They funded a lot of work throughout the country. We did some work in San Francisco Bay looking at sea level rise impacts on productivity and decomposition and marsh sustainability. They haven't funded a project in the Northwest to date, so we put in this proposal and got lucky, I think. But we're going to be looking at a couple of different aspects of sea level rise. A large part of the project will be on sort of wetland protective services in terms of flooding. And so Dave Sutherland and Stephen at PNNL are going to sort of lead that component. But the program really wanted to sort of tackle the idea that wetlands are important for a variety of reasons, and we want to look at a suite of services. So we added sort of, as motivated by this project, we added the greenhouse gas blue carbon component to it as well. So we're gonna try to collect some greenhouse gas measurements from the Columbia River and the Coos Bay Estuary. Scott Ridgen is gonna lead the methodology on that. We'll look at some ecosystem drivers associated with greenhouse gases, and then we'll incorporate all of this into an ecosystem model called Warmer. So Warmer incorporates accretion, decomposition, productivity. Some recent expansions of Warmer that we've been doing for San Francisco Bay also incorporate salinity and productivity differences. So we're going to try to use that model to ask some questions about, under different restoration scenarios, what happens to coastal protection, what happens to net greenhouse gas emissions. So that's the nuts and bolts of the proposal. We'll see if we can do it.
Yeah, so that's an example of one proposal that's already been funded that's going to get us partway down the road to starting to fill the greenhouse gas emissions data gap. And so, yeah, there's that. So Now, we have been funded, and the National Estuarine Research Reserve System Science Collaborative has been very good to us. So they funded the 2 projects that we're talking about today. And there's really no reason not to go back to those guys for a next proposal, for the very good reason that blue carbon remains a priority for the National Estuarine Research Reserve System, as well as the reserves that have been involved in these 2 projects, and that's Padilla Bay and South Slough. But we need to stay in touch with the managers, Jude and Bree Yednock at South Slough, to make sure that we're any proposals that we decide to put together are mingling well with reserve priorities. And the other good reason is that when we submitted the proposal for the carbon stocks project, we set that up, as I mentioned before, as the first step of a multi-step approach to filling data gaps in the Northwest. So there's an expectation that has been set up with this grantor that we come back and sort of finish the job, so to speak. So this slide is letting us know that they're about to issue their RFP, at least these 2, for collaborative research in what are called catalyst projects. And I'm going to focus on the research projects because they're probably the best fit for the project that I'm going to be talking about in a second here. So it makes sense to go back to these guys and develop another 3-year project. Unfortunately, they have lowered the total for 3 years from $750,000 to $600,000. And knowing that it was tough to get the carbon stocks project done for, I forget what our budget was, but it was something like $749,000.99. And we had to cut things. So we have that to contend with. So anyway, this is on us. It's not going to start for another year. There's a pre-proposal, and then there's a full proposal. So we hope to advance through that. So I think, here's the straw proposal idea, that we go for one of these research grants and ask for the full $600K, three-year project, and do 3 very basic things and maybe 4. So the first one is look at the field sites that we've already set ourselves up for with the carbon stocks project, figure out which ones are still relevant and which ones need to be added, or what additional sites need to be added because some of these data gaps that we've been talking about. Add the restoration sites that we had to lop off for the carbon stocks project, and conduct greenhouse gas emissions and carbon sequestration rate research. And that's a very loaded bullet point there. I know that we're going to, as we figure out how this is going to work, that's going to be quite a bit of discussion about how this gets done. There's even discussion about adding geographical range to this, like adding the reserve up in Alaska and maybe a reserve or 2 down in California, which on one hand sounds great because it's more more information, spreading the research out to include more habitats, and there's the side benefit of more reserves, gets the attention of the Near Science Collaborative, and that's a good thing. But it also complicates things, obviously. Also, the good news is Jude and Chris put together a proposal last year that started to go down this road. And Jude, can I put you on the spot to sort of, so it could be that we have a proposal or elements of a proposal to build on. So you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. So last year, as part of the same funding cycle that funded the Catalyst grant that was the feasibility study, Chris, myself, John Ribchick, Katrina Poppy, and Laura Brophy all worked together to draft a proposal that's really the follow-up to the Stocks project, which is to do sequestration rates at all of these sites based on some of the cores we had already taken, and then do strategic greenhouse gas analysis using, a portable, there's several really nice portable backpack type units with chambers to do strategic sampling of greenhouse gas emissions that would be informative in the way that we need, and that would be CO2, methane, and N2O. Kind of the same way that we piggybacked some sequestration cores on the stock proposal, we would piggyback greenhouse gas because we didn't have the capacity to do all of the sites. It reviewed really well two criticisms. One, it was way too much for 1 year Catalyst grant, which we totally agree with, and I'm glad it wasn't funded. And the other was that we relied too heavily on sort of the end user network and connections that were established as part of the carbon stocks project. So I think we sort of rested on our laurels from our first Pacific Northwest Blue Carbon project, saying, yeah, we've all got the end users dialed in, we know them, trust us. I don't think we defended that strongly enough, and that was clear in the reviews. But I think, so we put a lot of work and time into drafting that proposal. It's not shelf ready, but it could be turned around or adapted, and I'd love to see more mileage out of it.
Well, that's what we all tell ourselves as we're putting in hours upon hours on a proposal. It's like, if I don't get this, I can use this, somewhere else. So before we get into the weeds about that, the elements of that part, I wanted to talk about a couple other elements, and that's that I think it's important that we keep rolling on the database. So the concept is that we're going to be collecting new data, and we're going to be relying on any other existing data sets that are out there, and so it makes sense to keep populating that data set, and I think Chris would probably agree with that. Very possible. So I'm just throwing this out there. And then the third element is to circle back and take the data that we've collected here that we needed for the feasibility assessment that we've just been talking about, populated here, but use those new data to do some recalculating to sort of shore up the conclusions of that feasibility assessment. We were talking about this last night, and it doesn't sound like that would be an enormous task. It would be doable, but hold that thought. We still have to figure out how that would all work. Okay, and then the lateral carbon flux dynamics. I don't know if that fits in here, but we've heard a lot today, and there's a lot in the feasibility assessment about the need to nail that down a little bit more. So I wouldn't mind talking about any of this right now. Does anyone have a reaction? Is this crazy talk? Is that too much for a 3-year, $600,000 project? Yes. If so, how does it get shaved down? We've heard one suggestion that the database maybe gets proposed in a different part of the near sides collaborative programs. Microphone, anyone?
Okay. So I just wanted to throw my kind of, I'm very odd because I'm not really networked in. So I have some funding to be looking at changes that soils undergo, the physical properties, specifically soil moisture, temperature, and salinity as a restoration site is breached. And so alongside that, I'm collecting samples, I'm oven drying samples, and I'm storing samples. So I actually have samples from pollute pre-breach, and then I can easily go out and do samples post-breach. So I don't know if anybody wants that data, but it's there and it exists, and I'll be doing the exact same thing for Blue Heron Slough, which is also looking to breach. So essentially, I'm not personally actively pursuing monies for any carbon research, but it's definitely something I'd be willing to expand out into.
I think Haida has an idea or
I want to
response.
respond. Is this on? Yeah, I want to respond just because we had a really nice talk at lunch about this. And I think it's totally the right way to go to use the backpack samplers for what you're talking about with the collaborative grant. But another thing that we've trialed on our marsh at the lab in Squim is kind of continuous high-frequency sampling, like hourly sampling of greenhouse gas flux in an automated way. And the power that gives you is the ability to associate it with highly dynamic environmental variables, particularly like groundwater level, which is an association that we've seen in doing that. And what I thought would be cool when I was hearing what she's up to is to, and now I'm seeing here a catalyst grant, maybe a catalyst grant pairing that type of below ground work with, because she's got moisture, salinity, and temperature, I think.
Yeah, at 5 different depths.
At 5 different depths. To pair that with that high frequency surface greenhouse gas flux. And that system has nitrous oxide, methane, and carbon dioxide. So I'm kind of was thinking as you were talking, Craig, about why not have the Pacific Northwest group go for all 3 grants? Science transfer for database, catalyst for kind of new technology, and collaborative for exactly what you described.
Yeah. I'm with you. It's just that we're also hearing rumblings about. I'll just tell you that when the Pacific Northwest has done really well, South Slough and Padilla Bay have done really well, and I assume and hope that those reserves continue to do really well, but there could be, we should just keep in mind, I guess I should say it like this, we should keep in mind which one we want to prioritize, because they're, Jude, help me out here. I mean, I guess I'm not wanting us to flood the market, compete with ourselves, that kind of thing. So, but on the other hand, each one of these is its own separate, the science transfer would actually work. I mean, the RFP comes out in January. No, they all start at the same time. All right, so Yeah.
Well, my point was I already have the grant for the field collection. I already have the samples and stuff. So if it's
Right.
so it's literally the cost of processing
Okay.
samples, which is expensive.
Let's stay in touch
But,
then.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, can I just tell a quick funny joke that you guys should make you all laugh?
Yes.
All right. So I started working at Tulalip. I came from Montaigne Systems. And when I first started working here, my boss handed me a blue carbon paper. It took me over a year to realize that blue carbon just simply referred to like water and ocean carbon. I definitely thought it was like referring to like a reduced state, and I was trying to get all nerdy on it, and it was just something super simple.
Okay, were there, Chris, Jude?
Yeah, just I guess two minor comments just to throw into the mix. One is that, this goes back to the last comment, that if we can leverage other projects and other data, that's always to our advantage. So, we're working, for instance, in Bandon at that large restoration site. Our Tillamook project is probably going to go for another year. We have restoration sites in the Northwest. So that was one comment. Then the second was just in terms of the NER, I mean, expanding geographically is problematic in a lot of ways. But I think one of the, probably the motivation for setting up a nationwide network is that a nationwide network would get used for research. And if we could expand to Alaska and or the California reserves in some way, I think that would solely from the point of utilizing the network, that would be a strong.
Okay.
So the matrix you put together was great, Craig, with the different proposal opportunities, and Haida and Chris talking about the science transfer and the database.
Actually, that was stolen from the Near Science Collaborative.
Let's see. I didn't have to say that.
Yes, I do. We're on film here.
The database is a science transfer. To pull that out of the science collaborative piece, we would have to sort of work with CTP or like the clear step for that is how do we get that database information into the hands of planners or coastal managers, and how do we lead that to action, and then which is totally doable. But I think for that to be a science transfer, that's the piece that we would have to work on.
And that would make for a very competitive proposal. I would think. It's just that it has to be done in a year, right? So. Oh no, 2 years. So yeah, I like that idea.
Just following up on Chris's point, other NERs are thinking about their own blue carbon projects, and Alaska I know a little bit about, and there may be benefits of teaming, but I think they're going in a slightly different direction, and so I maybe consider exploring with them, but I think data sets will come for other NERs, so maybe think about your own needs first and what would be a good project here, and then say, well, maybe we might expand more if we've got a good reason to, because I think other sites will develop their own data sets as well in their own speed.
Yeah, and it's true that the again, the reserve managers, these concepts have to be a priority for the reserves. So they need to be excited about these projects, and it really has to fit with the reserve. Steve, with your mouth full, you were telling me about Alaska was going to be submitting something. Was that, I don't remember, was that collaborative research, or do you know which category?
TBD. They're trying to work out whether to go for a big grant or whether the odds are better to go for a small exploratory.
Okay.
I think they're going to go for a collaborative research grant. They're thinking about data collection now.
All right. Other, Haida?
I just wanted to, I guess, defend my effort to go for all three, or have some members here go for all three. if you look at a map of NERS, there's 2 in the northwest, and if you compare that to the same area in the northeast, there are multiples, and I think that really reflects the very understudied nature of our estuaries. I mean, estuarine ecologists on the East Coast didn't even really recognize West Coast estuaries as existing for decades, and I think maybe we need to really ramp up, you know, in our first year of the stocks, or of the working group, you know, really realizing the incredible data gaps that we have here, the kind of really sparse universities that we have compared to the East Coast and even the Gulf Coast, the sparse data record that we have, the newer settlement of the West Coast that's kind of tied into that. It's just, I think we can really make a strong case. I think it needs to be made. So I just wanted to put that.
I would not disagree with that at all. Erin?
Another maybe funding backup, since you'll know in time, just recognize that Washington Sea Grant, the next like science funding opportunity for that should be posted probably next fall, so you'll know whether or not you've got something here or need to fill in a blank. And I don't know if I'm supposed to say that I was on the review committee this year, but I was. And there were lots of carbon sequestration related projects, and they got rated really well. So I imagine it's gonna be the same the next time around, so just know that. Might be a nice way to fill in a gap if you go for collaborative research, don't get full of what you're asking for. Go to Washington Sea Grant to fill in that 2 years.
Okay.
You won't get a 3, but they do 2 years.
And I can't recall whether Sea Grant state Sea Grants are okay with funding throughout the region? Or are they more interested in a Washington-based, yeah.
So Washington Sea Grant would be more interested in funding the Washington projects, but I would imagine Oregon Sea Grant would have a similar, I don't know what their funding cycle looks like,
Right.
and California Sea Grant funds similar types of projects down in California too. I would imagine Alaska does, but I haven't done this kind of work in Alaska.
And do you know what the not to be too mercenary here, but what's the funding level?
Oh, I should know that. I don't know. I don't remember.
The last round was in the, it also comes with a 50% match, which is a factor.
But you'll have it.
In the,
Hmm.
oh,
Wait.
supplement this,
The
right?
supplement, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that. That's good input. Okay, other reactions? Ron? Microphone, anyone?
Yeah, marine macrophytes as a global carbon sink can be predicted or estimated could sequester 10 billion tons of carbon per year globally. So I'm just thinking that, well, as far as eelgrass, the good thing about eelgrass is the thing you can do to increase its area is increase the capacity of the system through things like making the water clear by removing nutrients. So there's something there that could be looked at. I think eelgrass should be maintained in whatever is done. I think it's important to keep that in mind. And I really do think looking at seaweeds and kelp, because they're, especially in the Northwest, are tremendously productive. And what happens to the carbon there is another thing that I don't know who's looking at that in the United States. I really don't know. But evidently there's a lot of discussion about it internationally.
Can you guys give the microphone to Steve?
One more thing relative to eelgrass, Morro Bay, the eelgrass meadow collapsed completely there. And that over in the during the blob period, and they think it was related to higher temperatures, and it's not recovering. And that's with a huge loss of 160 hectares or 200 hectares. Why, that's a problem, a big problem. So anyway, another reason.
Steve?
to build on this, maybe pass it out a bit. The question about kelp, I think is definitely worth exploring. How would we do it in terms of these projects? There's maybe a couple of ways. If there was a proposal on a locked in as carbon or carbon flux, that might be a natural one to fit together. If you do the kelp, you do the marshes, think about all of the ecosystem and the fluxes together. So that might be one proposal, and then your carbon sequestration would be another one. You could do an early scoping assessment of the kelp question, which I don't think a lot of work has been done, just even scoping it out for the region. You could do that as a catalyst, maybe, as a forerunner to a bigger project. So focus on the carbon sequestration and some with the methane and the collaborative research. Think about the kelps, if you want to go in that direction, as a catalyst option. And try and go for two, separate them out.
Well, here's a question. To date, as mentioned, the working group has been sort of guided by the methodology. And methodology right now doesn't include seaweeds. So is it bad to use that as a reason to prioritize eelgrass over seaweeds? You know, again, I'm trying to pull us into some kind of specific areas here. Manageable areas, manageable projects.
You know, there's no methodology for seaweeds. It would have to be developed. But because there's not a methodology, doesn't mean we shouldn't explore these carbon dynamics and fluxes.
Right. But the question is that a priority now or later? Or while we're doing the eelgrass, is there a benefit to pulling in seaweed? Like, it wouldn't be that much more of a, although I guess it seems like it would, but.
I'll also mention in the last month, 3 different groups have come to us asking how they could help develop a methodology for kelp. So that side of it might fix itself if there's a reason we think to do it.
Right.
So I think we're really the science side is the part that's lacking.
Fair enough.
I'll just add to that that the first step in developing a methodology for kelp is understanding what happens to it.
Right.
So that all goes together. And I enjoyed a really good blue carbon salad last night. Really good seaweed salad.
So my head is wrapping around all the different things we've been talking about. Tapping in, I think we're all probably aware of the Puget Sound Restoration Fund project around kelp. Just know that, I mean, kelps are something that are being explored around OA mitigation. And so there's some motivation for that cross-pollination to be thinking about them as potential carbon sequestration sources. There's a project that SQUIRT was recently, the Southern California Coastal Water Resource Project down in Southern California that was recently funded to do some similar type of research that they're doing up here with the Puget Sound Restoration Fund. So it's a growing area of research from the frame of OA. So if we can figure out how to link that up with understanding carbon sequestration potential for that species, then it just makes it more valuable.
Good input.
On the kelp, one of the issues we talked about last month on the kelp, one of the shortcomings of including kelp and seagrass for that matter in any sort of blue carbon climate change mitigation strategy is where does it go? And if it goes to deep oceans, well, whose jurisdiction is that? That's not the United States, it's international waters. So you can't claim a credit for it. So there is some shortcomings to thinking about where the carbon will go.
So I think there's several things here, and the point that was made about linking to OA first, some of the information needs for thinking about how you would manage kelp for ocean acidification, you'd want the same information for carbon management. Like how are you going to change the acreage? How are you going to do it? They're all the same questions. So then the question you come about, you got there, Boone, who owns the carbon when it goes somewhere else is an important question. I think that's solvable, particularly if it's within, within the economic zone. That makes it a bit easier. But there's also the question, okay, you produce the carbon over here in the kelp, but you've got to manage the sink area. You know, just like we're thinking about mangroves and marshes, it's managing the sink. And so while you're getting production, if you're not managing the sink area, then you don't necessarily have a net change. So there are additional complexities. I don't think we should shy away from them. We should try and tackle them. 10 years ago, nobody said we could do the blue carbon thing, but we tackled all the questions that they had bit by bit. And I think we should think the same way about the kelps.
So I just have a few thoughts on seaweeds as well. I mean, I think they're super, I would love to do a kelp project, but I think they do open such a can of worms, particularly in terms of methodology of studying where that carbon goes. I mean, you know, a lot of that may be deposited in offshore shelf regions and canyons where you need submersibles to actually sample. So I think there's a lot of motivation for kelp restoration and understanding kelp forests, particularly in like Sonoma County, Mendocino County, Northern California. They've basically seen in the last couple of years complete crash of the Nereocystis forest. So urchin barrens are becoming incredibly abundant in that part of the state. The Nereocystis forests are crashing. People are panicking. I mean, I've seen on previous NewsHour, or not NewsHour, but you know, media are picking up the story. Fishing games heavily involved in that. So I think there will be a lot of potential to build end user coalitions and people interested. But I think the methodology would be so different than what we're used to in these projects that it would be a challenge. The other point that came to mind is they were worried about, so in the 50s and 60s there was a lot of pollution in Southern California and it decimated the kelp forests. You had eutrophication of coastal waters and you had like 95% loss of the Palos Verdes kelp forest. So there was a lot of motivation in the subsequent decades to do restoration, but the kelp restoration is extremely expensive. So we can restore, you know, it's fairly expensive to restore a marsh and open up the levees, but I think there were estimates of like $1 million an acre to restore kelp forests. So as a sort of strategy for blue carbon and mitigating habitat loss, there could be really huge costs involved there.
Carbon price is going to have to go up a little bit.
Can I just, this kelp is super exciting and there's a lot of enthusiasts out there. We could spend a lot of time talking about kelp, but I actually think it's really low on the list of blue carbon priorities that we have. I mean, it's emerging in this conversation now. If we decide that's the direction we want to go, we could talk about it more deeply, but I'm just going to, being in touch with the Puget Sound Partnership and PSRF and the Northwest Straits and all the like nascent kelp work that's being done and really having a hard time them getting end users other than, I think we might wait a year or two before adding that to our, but I'm just going to put that out there.
Yeah. Overall, I'm hearing that there's a lot more conversation that needs to happen on that topic, and it's October, and the RFP is going to come out this month. So I agree that we should not forget that conversation, but move forward with some things that are more related to the kinds of things that we were focused on today. So. It's 4:30, past 4:30, and we told you guys we'd get out of here pretty soon. So in sum, and I'm going to follow up with you guys with a summary of this workshop, as I've done before, actually, and we have things recorded as well. But in summary from this session, what I'm getting, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, is that we probably focus on these elements, these top two for the research program. Go for the science transfer funding for that one, And I can't remember, Haida, what you were talking about for the next step catalyst.
It's also greenhouse gas emissions, but it's
So it's the new, it's the,
high frequency, hourly,
okay,
so it's technology development.
technology development
At
for,
like restoration sites looking at environmental
okay.
correlations, especially hydrology.
Yeah, okay, so I don't know if you all caught that, but it's a technology development proposal coming out of the Catalyst Grant, which is what the Catalyst Grant is designed to do. And can that be done in a year?
What do you think, Michelle? Yes.
Yes, okay, the answer is yes. Say yes. Okay, so I think we've captured at least the starting point for some RFPs here. And everyone's motivated to pitch in, and we've got Jude and Chris's proposal to look for narrative pieces and some concepts to borrow from that as well for the research project. Anything else? Parting shots? Microphone? Sorry.
You mentioned already the reserve priorities, so I think it would be useful. I mean, I know I haven't looked at the reserve priorities in a couple of years, so probably be useful to review what Padilla and South Slough and maybe some of the other West Coast reserves have listed.
I've reached out to at least Jude and Bree.
They are just being revised and they will be distributed.
Okay.
New, and they're pretty much the same, except maybe more emphasis on a little bit more punch on blue carbon.
Right.
So.
Oh.
Like irradiance and gradients to include the Alaska and Southern Cal sites, if at all possible, for West Coast look at things.
Okay. And then we've got the Washington Sea Grant to sort of consider for auxiliary funding, also Oregon Sea Grant as well. Anything else? This is your last chance to weigh in. All right, well, you guys, thank you very, very much for contributing to what I thought was a really productive day. And again, thanks for your patience with the microphone action. Maybe next time we'll have 6 microphones, to be distributed around. So, thank you. And yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thank you. That's it. And we are adjourned. Thank you.